Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to yet another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits, where, as always, we fling open the doors of your local comic book shop and talk to your favorite creators of yesterday and today. But before we get to the awesomeness that is the Dollar Bin Bandits, let's get to the introductions. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Mike Farah.
And our buddy Orrin cannot be with us at the moment, but have no fear. He's in this interview. Okay. And we're talking to none other than Graham Nolan. Graham has had a really long career and run on Detective Comics. He worked on Bane for DC, obviously, and he created his own comic book company known as Compass Comics. Created basically his own little world. He has 3 titles, or 4 at this point, I believe, but they are under his own imprint, and it's really his own world. So they all kind of come together at one point or another. Really interesting guy, and he's had a really interesting career.
So I missed out on this one, which is kind of a running theme in the past few weeks. But I was jealous, as always, because Graham Nolan, I know from his work on Detective Comics and with Chuck Dixon, co-creating Bane. So he's a name that is recognizable to me, and I love to hear that he's sort of gone the independent route and created his own stuff, which is always interesting. I did want to note also that he worked for a while on the Phantom comic strip, and we always like creators that have some sort of attachment to the Phantom. Small but mighty group. But let's get to the interview. This is Graham Nolan.
And today we are joined by none other than Graham Nolan. Thank you, sir, for joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing awesome. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. And we're going to kick it off the same way we do with all our interviews. And we asked everyone how you discovered comics.
Sort of circuitous. I was a monster kid, and I read monster magazines, and there was peripheral comic book stuff in there. Of course, I knew who some of the superheroes were from other media. The Batman TV show when I was a kid, The Adventures of Superman, and the Spider-Man cartoon show. But it wasn't until the 6th grade when my teacher brought in a stack of comics for all the kids in the class to read at recess, or after tests, that type of thing. And there was a Justice League comic in there, and it had all these characters that I knew from other media, Superman, Batman, Aquaman, and that just lit me up. I was like, wow, this stuff is really cool. I was at that perfect age of like 11 or 12. And so then I'd go up to the local luncheonette where they had the magazines and comics and stuff like that. And that's when I discovered, Marvel comics and other, detective and action comics and all that kind of stuff. And the rest is history.
So that was basically the coolest teacher in the world.
Yeah. In fact, I told him about that years later too. I found him because he had found out what I had done and all that kind of stuff. And so I met with him and had lunch with him one time, and he was just over the moon. The fact that was his first year teaching too. He was a young teacher. He was like 22, right out of college, just got his teaching degree, and my class was his first class.
That's pretty awesome.
Really
That
cool.
is pretty awesome.
Yeah, his name is Bruce Schneider.
Very, very cool.
Give him some props.
So I know with DC, you did some work on New Talent Showcase and a few other things from there, and then they essentially put you on to Power of the Atom. Once you got onto that book, did you feel you were able to put your own spin on the character, or were you sort of held to how previous artists were doing the character?
Well, my path was a little bit more not quite as linear, because I started at DC, and then I went to Eclipse, and I was doing a lot of work at Eclipse for a couple of years, and then I went to Marvel, and I did a project there on the Transformers before I came back to DC, and then at DC I did a few issues of Doom Patrol, and then I got Power of the Atom.
Gotcha.
So just to keep that clear, and then to answer your question, I think John Byrne was the original artist on Power of the Atom before I took over. So, I followed him, and I guess I kind of, I started buying up back issues of the old Gil Kane Adam comics and stuff to see what the source material was, because I always look at the source material whenever I take on something that's pre-existing. I don't like to just go into it and change things. I like to see, what worked, why we're still doing this character, what made him tick, what made him popular, and then take that and then maybe modernize it or bring my own stamp to it.
So, in your opinion, what was working for the character that you sort of picked up on?
Well, Roger Stern's scripts were really good. He actually, he took sort of like this B character and made him cooler. I didn't really care for the Atom as a kid. Just, so he's small. Who wants to be small? But Roger gave him some cool things, like he could alter his weight and mass and stuff like that, and like he'd use his whole body as a bullet to bust through. It was when they were doing the Invasion crossover, and so like there was a couple issues there where I had to tie that in. And I remember the Atom, like, would shrink down, but he'd keep his 180-pound mass and like bust through this alien's armor and go right through his shoulder and stuff. And I thought that was really cool.
Now, how long was your run on that book? About a year or so, correct?
I rode that horse into the sunset. So I think let's see, I think I started like with issue 7, something like that. And I went to 18. So like 11 issues. Yeah, close to a year.
What was the experience like for you to work on one book for sort of an extended period of time?
Well, the first book that I did for an extended period was The Prowler at Eclipse. But this was like the first book that I had that was sort of mainstream. And that was really cool, it wasn't quite in my wheelhouse. I wanted to do other things. I always wanted to do Batman. But that was in the future.
We're going to get to that. Don't worry.
And Superman. I always wanted to do Superman too.
All right, there you go. One thing I'm always curious with artists is, at what point in your career did you feel comfortable with your own art, or you're putting your own style onto characters? So I know for some people it takes a while to feel like they really belong.
That's a really great question, because I talked about this on some of my own streams, that I never really felt comfortable until around I think it's like issue 5 or issue 6 of Hawkworld. That was a turning point for me. That at that point I can look back at the work and say, okay, you arrived here. You're starting to make smarter decisions. Your skill level is starting to sharpen. I can look at it and not throw up, and and see the growth pattern there. I didn't really get really confident in my work until I was probably 40. And the funny thing is that when you're not confident, everything suffers from it. When you look at confident artists, like let's say a guy like Klaus Janson, who is inking something, now he's got a very bold inking style because he's confident, and he'll put down this big ass black line, just bam, and he says, "That's my line. We'll take it or leave it." That's awesome. When you get somebody that's trepidous, who doesn't know, or then it becomes weak, and it looks the work, whether it's an ink line or it's the way you render a figure, it looks weak, and it looks unsure of himself. And when you get that confidence to put it down and really go in a different direction, say, well, I'm going to try this angle. Fuck it if it doesn't work. Bam, I'm going to put it down. That's when you really grow.
Yeah. And speaking of Hawkworld, you were there from the very beginning. John Ostrander took the project. What was it like to be on a book from ground zero and to grow with the book?
That was really cool. I had worked with Tim Truman over at Eclipse Comics, because he he was the co-creator of the Prowler, and so he and John K. Snyder III did the main story, the modern day Prowler, and then I and oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on this gentleman's name, who wrote the Prowler backup stories that I did. So I knew Tim. Tim was a fellow Kubert School grad too. You know, he graduated a few years before me. And so when he had done that Prestige series, for DC with Alcatina, it did really successful, and so they spun it off. But he didn't want to draw it, so he and Ostrander wrote it, and then he suggested me to do the artwork. So that was the first time, I was there from a number one, and I took that was 2 years, I think I ran on that book.
As an artist, how important is it for you to have, I guess, a relationship with the writer, that that there's some sort of an interaction or a familiarity with each other?
I think it's really important because comics are a marriage of words and picture. Will Eisner said it best that when the script gets to the artist's hands, the story is now the artist's, and it's his job to tell the story visually. But having said that, I think it's important for the artist to maintain the feeling that the writer was going for, and by having a relationship with the writer, I think that's a good thing, that you can talk things out, you can offer suggestions on how to make something better visually, because you're all in it for the same thing, is to make the coolest looking comic and story that you can do. So I mean, John and I were very different people, politically, and it shows up in his work. And I had some gripes about some of the stuff that he would put in the stories, but we could, in those days, you could hash out differences and have discussions with people of different thought processes, and because you were there again as professionals to create the best comics you could. So I have nothing but great respect for John Ostrander and Mike Gold, the editor, too, because Mike, he's one of those great editors that doesn't try to micromanage. A great editor will pick the talent and put it together and then get out of the way. And that's what Mike did. So that is what allowed me to expand and explore in my own art without being micromanaged. I could say, well, he's not going to come down on me if I try this inking style, or I try this type of a layout pattern or something like that, because again, he's, make it look great. That's the edict you have. Make it look great,
So you mentioned that you wanted to work on Batman, and you did. And
Did I?
Not only did you work on Batman, but one of the most epic storylines that Batman has ever been involved in, the Knight's Fall storyline, which was just amazing. I mean, during the period of time where they're taking all the big characters and they're really shaking them up. Superman gets killed, Aquaman gets his hand gnawed off by piranhas, which, whatever. Batman gets his back broken.
I always wondered how come he didn't swim in circles after that.
That's for another episode. Hal Jordan gets, everything that happens to him.
Yeah.
What is that like for you to work on Batman, and not just, not just a regular issue? This is a major storyline.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny because when you're in the middle of it, you're not thinking of it as an epic or major storyline because that history hasn't been written yet. It's a job. We knew we were planning this big event, and we hoped it would be a big event. That's what you always do when you do this stuff, is you want everything to be a success, but you don't know it's going to be a success. So it was a crazy time. It was busy. We were publishing a Batman book like every week, and each one had to tie in. And for Chuck and I, because we were the fastest team. So like if something was happening in Batman, Chuck already had the script ready for Detective. And if there was a character or let's say a setting or a MacGuffin or something like that that needed to be designed for the Batman comic, and I got my script ahead of time, I would do the designs and send it backwards, and then those guys would do it, would work on it. Yeah, it was kind of an interesting and crazy time, but it was a lot of fun.
As an artist, did you get, and working on such a important character to DC as Batman, did you get any free reign as pertains to this? Because there was new stuff. There was certainly a new uniform being introduced,
Right.
or a new costume being introduced. So there's room to play with.
Mhm.
And Batman's costume was evolving. What Azrael was imparting his little flair to it. So did you get to kind of play with this a bit, or was DC saying, no, this is what you're gonna, do this?
Well, as far as the costume goes, you had to play with it. Joe Quesada designed the Azrael costume, and he only had to draw it once. I had to draw it, how many issues for how many panels for how many pages. I wanted to punch him in the mouth.
That's funny. That was actually my next question, because I was like, was that a pain in the ass for you to draw? I mean, because
It
it's
was a real
just,
pain.
as you're talking, I have the Death of Superman poster in the distance, and he has his big, all over the top costume. And, just looking at it, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, and there's a functionality issue of it. He's got those big spike things here. How do you
Right.
see anywhere on the side? But all right, suspension of disbelief. I'll give you that. For cool,
this is a rich guy who fights crime at night too. So
yeah, we're willing to give up certain things, but in fact, when people ask for commissions of that, I say no. That's on the no draw list.
that's interesting.
I did my penance.
What was there anything you wanted to do with or to Batman style wise or artistically during that period that maybe you just didn't get a chance to do for whatever reason?
No, I mean, the storylines were pretty much set on where we were going and everything. So it wasn't until after we got done with the Knight's Quest, and a Knight's End, Bruce Wayne comes back, before I got to draw more of the real Batman, And then at that point, we started doing, in Detective, we started doing standalone or 2-issue story arcs with some of the classic villains we would bring back, because we had now free reign to do that kind of stuff.
Did you guys have an idea of the impact it was having on fans? All this story going on and the fans' reaction to it.
Yeah, I mean, if royalties are any indication of it, then yeah, it was pretty clear. It was reaching the public.
Let's talk about the big guy himself, Bane. What's your earliest memories of the idea of creating this villain being brought up?
I had gotten a call from Scott Peterson. I had done a couple fill-in issues on Detective, and they really liked it, and they were going to offer me Detective as the regular series. And he told me about this thing that they were going to be doing, and they needed this new villain and wanted to know if I wanted to design it. And I think it's hard to put it in the proper maybe lineage, but this is the way I remember it. Then I called Chuck because I knew Chuck was writing it, and Chuck and I, went way back at Eclipse Comics together. And I asked, Chuck says, you got to take this job. You got to take this. It's going to be huge, because he's been in the writing meetings. And I said, okay, that sounds good. So, we talked, he sent me notes about what he and Denny and stuff had come up with for all that. And then it was up to me to design his look, and knowing where this character was in this like Central American prison. Is how I settled on the luchador look, because I figured that might be what he would be exposed to, a costume. If he was going to be exposed to one, it would be from that region.
For you personally, what character aspects did this villain need to have in order to be, I guess, as impactful as he was?
Well, he has to be relatable, and that's true for any villain. You have to be able to find something in him you see in yourself. Because if he's just, snidely whiplash, the turning of the mustache, villain, he's a one-trick pony, and the thing that's really cool about Bane, I think that really worked out well with him, is that Bane's Bane's view of the world is he's a victim. That he and in a way he's right. He was sentenced to a lifetime in prison for a crime he didn't commit. His father committed it. He was born in that prison, so the prison and the environment grew him into this angry beast that he became. And so he justifies everything he does by the fact that he deserves it. The world owes him, and that's sort of a thing a lot of people can relate to, because there's a lot of narcissists out in the world that think the world owes them something instead of going out and getting it themselves, So I think that's how Bane connected with people.
How many iterations of the character did you draw before they settled on the look that became Bane? Wow.
One.
Nice.
Home run right from the start.
The first sketch, I nailed 99.8%. The only difference is from what you see and what the original sketch was. It was that I had more wires going into his head, and the biggest change is the mask. The shape of the mask is the same, but editorial decided that they want, because I had a real luchador mask on him, for functionality and for the ability to have the character emote. I had the mouth, the nose, and the eyes open, even though the same patterns were on the mask. And then editorial decided to close up the mask and make him a mystery man type of thing. And I, again, this is a suspension of disbelief, because I have a luchador Bane mask. I mean, the closed up one, and you can wear it for about 10 minutes and you're dying. So the functionality aspect that I was going for is gone. But in that spirit of suspension of disbelief, it looks cooler with the mask covering, that mystery man. I think it was a good decision.
I think so too. Are you nervous at all right before Bane debuts of how it's going to be accepted by fans, or were you pretty confident that this is a home run right here? And
neither. It was just, I was working on the next book. Your head is this way going forward, and the stuff you finished that's being published, it's, you're not even considering it, But then you start getting the sales numbers coming in, and people start talking about it, and the buzz in the media. Now, then there was no social media. There was no, it was just, magazines, fan magazines, write-ups and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And it was pretty clear early on that, this was successful. It was going to be good.
Between the two Batman movies that came out that featured Bane, were either of them anywhere close to what you had in mind?
No. No, they blew both of those. The Bane in outside media that I do like is the animated series, the first one, because they gave him the luchador mask that I originally designed, which is cool, and you had Henry Silva doing his voice, one of the Rat Pack, which is really cool, and he gave him a Latino accent. And then the other one was, I believe it's Young Justice Bane, where he has the straight up costume that I designed, and then he's voiced by Danny Trejo. which is like that's the voice I hear in my head, that kind of gravelly, scary, Mexican, sound.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was a cool version.
Yeah.
I don't like
that?
these hulky versions, like the Gotham Arkham Asylum. You know, that was
Okay.
a watershed moment when that game came out, because there was a period there where there wasn't, Bane wasn't appearing in much, and then he appears in that game, and it goes through the roof, and it exposes the character to an entirely new generation of fans, and it was great, for the pocketbook. But I didn't like that. I don't like that hulkish sized Bane. My Bane is like the biggest bodybuilder you're ever going to meet, but he's still human. He's not a guy who can lift up a car and throw it, and he's not the Hulk. That's the point.
But
He's
he
an
was
evil Doc
third in
Savage. That was the hook. Like because Chuck knew what a huge Doc Savage fan I was. So the hook was, Bane is the evil Doc Savage. He's super smart, and if you look, he even has the helpers, just like Doc Savage had. There was Ham, Rennie, Monk, Long Tom, and Bane has Trog, Zombie, and Bird, all named after '60s rock bands, by the way.
Oh wow.
Wow. Did you ever think that character would grow to be so big? And I mean mainly in the comics, because he's kind of, as most of these villains do, they make an appearance and make a splash, they go away and come back, and when they come back, they mix it up a bit. And he has certainly gone on to bigger and better things in terms of really shaking up the status quo for Batman and his family. What did you ever think that would happen? Because I know, for some of these large events, let's say compared to Doomsday and Superman, made a big splash and then went away for a significant amount of time without really doing much. Was that the intention when Bane was, created initially?
Well, we wanted the character to have legs. We didn't know what type he would have. We knew he was popular in the series, but when the series was over, how popular was that popularity going to be maintained? Doomsday, is more of a cipher, a tool necessary to kill Superman. But as a character, he's not really much of a character. Whereas Bane has much more complexity to him.
Right.
And I'm not dissing the Superman guys. It was just, that's just how that character ended up. He's sort of just massive strength and brutishness and anger and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas Bane had reason and was very intelligent, and so I think that's why he was able to come back in many different iterations.
Did you ever think you'd be back on Bane?
I'm not back on Bane.
Well, working on when you revisited Bane, it was a Bane Conquest.
Oh, Bane Conquest.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That was sort of a payoff. They had to. That wasn't because they really wanted us to do it, but we thought that, okay, we're going to take this thing and we're going to, reestablish Bane the way we created him, as this intelligent tactician and stuff. And so we were trying to create him as the Doctor Doom of the DC universe, and we set him up for that. And we left all kinds of breadcrumbs, giving him apocalyptic tech and all that kind of stuff. And we had all kinds of directions we were going to go with it if they decided that they wanted to spin that off. But they put all their eggs in Tom King's basket on that whatever that Bane series was he did. Naked Bane, I like to call it.
So that's pretty funny. So shifting from Bane, you worked on a couple of crossovers, JLA versus Predator and Batman and Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
What is that like for you, working on two just totally, first of all, a group book, JLA, and you are throwing in the Predator.
Mm-hmm.
That's badass, first of all. But you're working on non-DC properties as pertains to Predator. What is that experience like for you as an artist? That just seems like you could have fun with that.
Well, I got two great stories about both those books. So the first book was the Batman Spider-Man one. That one came out first.
Yep.
And when that was offered to me, I told Scott Peterson that what I wanted to do was I wanted to illustrate Batman my way, the way I do, because I was still working on the series. But I wanted to draw the Spider-Man and Spider-Man characters in a John Romita style. And so I did some sketches to show him the differences and stuff and how I would marry that with the backgrounds all being connected. And he liked it. And that's what I did with that book. And then the next year I was in San Diego and I was sitting at the DC booth signing. And Chuck came up to me and said, "Hey, John Romita just sat down at his table." So I bolted up and I went over to John Romita's table, and because I'd never met him before, and he was my first influence, the first artist whose work I recognized, and I was like, wanted to be, so I wanted to pay respects to him and tell him that. So I got in a line and I waited and waited and waited. Finally, I get up to him and I said, "Mr. Romita, my name's Graham Nolan." And he looked at me and he goes, "Graham Nolan, the artist?" I'm like, he knows who I am. And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "I really liked your Batman Spider-Man book."
That's awesome.
So I said, I said, I can retire. I can retire. So now we flash forward to Batman JLA Predator. And the premise of that was to be like a throwback story, like it was JLA versus the Injustice Society. Remember how they would do that? And it was like a Superman bad guy, a Batman bad guy. And this was what was going to happen with the Predators. There was going to be a Superman Predator, a Batman Predator, and one that each one would represent. And so I had to design a Predator outfit so that it was clear which one he represented. And so, like, instead of the Superman shield, I used like the Predator topography to create something to indicate that that's the Superman shield, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of all this design work I did for all these characters in the Justice League. I submit it to the editor, and he says, "Okay, get going." I get 36 pages in, and I get a call from him, and he says, "Dark Horse didn't approve the designs. They want to have the Predators in their regular outfit." And I'm like, "Are you shitting me?" Now I got to go back in every one of these panels and do that really complicated Predator outfit for all these things. Oh my God. I almost left the business at that point. It was the book that almost got. I was working in syndicated strips, I think, around the same time, and so, or I was beginning to, or something like that. I forget what the timeline was again, but I remember thinking, "Oh shit, this business is getting for the birds,"
Because they have like the very intricate armor and like chainmail netting or stuff.
Yeah. So I repaired a lot of it, and then there's certain panels in there that somebody up at staff or at Dark Horse redrew, and it's clear it wasn't me.
Oh,
yeah,
that's disappointing.
So that was a complete disaster. It could have been so much fun too, because again, I got to reunite with John Ostrander. He wrote it, and that first comic that my teacher gave me was a Justice League comic. It was an opportunity for me to do the Justice League, so I was excited about it. But it was one of those projects that just went quick.
That's disappointing, because I know the Predator versus series, Predator versus Batman, Predator versus Alien, obviously, and many other stuff. I mean, it's been so successful. Like that should have, you would think, but maybe at the time, Justice League was a little too sunny for the Predator. Maybe Justice League now, which is very depressing and angsty. That may
But you
work.
know what? Ostrander wrote some really cool stuff in there. It was like there was a Predator. There was a sequence where the Predator pulled John Jones's, the Martian Manhunter's spine out. But it didn't kill him because evidently, the Martian physiology or something like that, and how we can change his shape and stuff. He was able to survive it, and he had his head on a pike. And I drew that, and it was really cool. It was in the foreground. Superman and Batman were in the background, looking at it, shocked to see their partner sitting there. And I had the blood coming out, and they whitewashed that whole sequence and redid something on it. It just looked terrible. It looks cartoony when I drew all this cool, gruesome stuff.
You see, that's something that really I think would probably fly more now, because
Yeah.
if you see all the stuff that they're doing, like especially with the DC Deceased, if you've seen that, it's like, DC heroes as zombies and stuff like that. I mean, they get pretty graphic and violent on in those issues and stuff, but that's something that should definitely fly nowadays, I think. But
yeah.
So
Shifting that editor got fired.
Now you know why.
Mhm.
Because he was stupid.
That's right.
So I know Oren is going to run with this one, but I had to ask about Phantom. He is a beloved character, been around forever, and it seems like anybody and everybody has, dipped their toes in the Phantom's water. What is that like for you working on that character? And did you ever feel any amount of pressure working on a character like that? So much history, so many people involved in it. It just, and it seems like it's made its rounds as well in terms of publishers and things of that nature.
Well, the reality is the Phantom wasn't in many hands because his home was in the strips. And outside of Ray Moore, Wilson McCoy, and Cy Barry, those are the three main ones that took it from 1936 all the way up until the 1980s. Three guys. And then Lee Falk wrote all that stuff. And then Cy's assistant took over, and then I took over on the strip. So licensed comic books and stuff. There was a bunch of different artists here, but for the main Phantom stuff, it's really a really short list, which is kind of cool. And in fact, I was the first person to ever write and draw a Phantom Sunday.
Wow.
When Tony DePaul was in a motorcycle accident, he was incapacitated, and they needed a script, and I pitched a story called The Sinbad Stone to Jay Kennedy at King, and he liked it, and he said, "Okay, do it." So at that point, I became the first writer artist on the Phantom.
Yeah, we actually just had Cy on the show a couple days ago, and he was talking about his experiences on the Phantom and working with Lee Falk, and how that was sort of tough to do at times.
Right.
Lee Falk sort of wanted to be the star of the show and didn't want other folks getting credit for drawing and stuff like that.
Yeah. There's a lot of writers that are like that.
Yeah.
That in a visual medium, they think it's all theirs, and it's because it was their idea. And
Right.
oh, wait a minute, this is a visual medium.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Phantom also has a huge international appeal.
Yes,
Very
bigger than in the United States.
Yeah, I was just say Europe and South America,
Australia, and the Nordic countries. It's Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Australia are the biggest markets for the Phantom.
Wow. Now, is it crazy for you when you get fan mail or fans from all over the world who recognize your art from the Phantom?
Well, I don't get it anymore because I've been off the strip for quite a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did get stuff. I got into deep doo-doo with Phantom fans because I did in that story that I wrote, The Sinbad Stone. It was picking up after Tony's story, where we introduced this terrorist character, and then the Phantom got blown up. So my story picks up with him convalescing, and he's in the cave in bed, and Diana is nursing his wounds and stuff, and he's not in his costume without his mask. And one of the tenets is nobody sees the Phantom's face. None of the fans see that. Obviously, Diana sees it. But the fans aren't supposed to see it. And I thought I coaxed it in enough shadows, so that you couldn't pick this guy out of a lineup type of thing. But evidently, some of these Phantom fans are so hardcore, they're like, "Oh, you showed the Phantom's face, you're going to hell."
You trying to say comic book fans are cranky people? I don't understand.
These are comic strip fans, so they are cranky people.
They could have been they could have been Star Wars fans. That would have been really bad.
That would have been worse.
How would you compare working on a comic book and a comic strip? Because I hear working on a comic strip, there's almost no time off. Like it just constantly, you just got to keep going and going and going with it.
Yeah, the two things about working on a strip is that it never ends, is one. So like if you're working on a book, I finished an issue of Detective Comics. My routine would be, okay, that one's done. I clean up the studio. I get my reference stuff put away. I get the new script. I gather up information for that one, and then I start fresh. Whereas with a comic strip, it's just this grind. If you want a vacation, you work ahead. It is tough. And I was doing two strips. I was doing the Phantom Sunday, and then I was doing the Rex Morgan Daily and Sunday at the same time. So all of that stuff had to be done in a single week. So it was a lot of work. And then the other big thing is the real estate you have to work in. The newspaper strips are very strict in its formatting. The Sundays, the top tier, you can't have any plot development in the top tier because a lot of papers cut that out. It's called the drop-off tier. And then there are places where you can break panels on the second two tiers, but they have to break in the same thirds. It's broken into thirds, so that some papers they'll stack them, or they'll change. They'll which is ridiculous because it's no respect for the design and elements of the artist. Your work, we read left to right, and you've got a flow going, and these guys don't give a shit. They just stick it anywhere, and it's like you lose the momentum. So yeah, those are the two major differences in strips versus comic books.
One more question I have is, I want to jump way back to what you mentioned, working at Eclipse, because I think independent comic books of the 80s, like Eclipse Comics, First Comics, Comico, I don't think they're really getting the credit they deserve for the creativity and what they were doing at the time. I mean, I don't know if they were competing with Marvel and DC, maybe as an alternative to Marvel and DC, but there was some really brilliant stuff coming out of there. Overall, what was your Eclipse experience like?
It was wonderful. I think of the 80s as the second golden age of comics because of that influx of other publishers that were willing to do different genres. You had people like Howard Chaykin and Mike Barron and Steve Rude and Tim Truman, all creating creator-owned new stuff, completely different. Grendel was another one, Matt Wagner. There's so many great genres that were being explored. And working at Eclipse, it was just, I got to do Skywolf, which was the Airboy backup with Chuck Dixon, and that's where we met. And then I got to do the Prowler, and I did some of their sci-fi and horror stuff. So I was always working in different genres, and I was always experimenting with styles and inking and stuff, and expanding my own skills without the big stage of doing it at Marvel or DC. So it was a great learning experience. And in some ways, that's sort of what 2023 is now becoming, at least for me, since like 2019. I've been doing independent comics again because I can't stand what the big two put out, and the readers agree because they're leaving in droves and they're looking for really good entertainment. And so that's the kind of stuff I'm focusing on, is different genre stuff that I enjoy, that I know other people enjoy.
To that point, can you share some other stuff that you have been working on?
Sure. Do you mean like share my screen or...
Oh, no, just tell us a little bit about it.
Oh,
Because
okay.
I'm certain. So just a little background about Orrin and I. Orrin kind of stopped reading newer comics around what, 93.
Mhm.
Not knocking it, totally fine, because there were a lot of people who, just
Oh,
kind
so
of,
you weren't even around for Bane. You
Oh,
left
I
it.
was around.
he was around.
That's
His
after Bane was sort of my cutoff, where
Yeah.
everything was
Okay.
in poly bags and everything had a foil on it, and I was just
Right.
like, all right.
Right.
So Orrin and our friend Mike are the ones that got me into comics at that time. So I kind of took that baton and ran with it. And I still read comics today, but like you said, the two, Marvel and DC, like, I have my stuff that I go to and I enjoy, obviously, like Superman, but um I am certainly interested in other stuff. And I
Right.
find the other than DC comics, or other than Marvel and DC comics, to be much more compelling and interesting.
Yeah. Well, I established a company called Compass Comics in 1998 when even back then I didn't like the direction comics were going. So I created a book called Monster Island. And I wrote that for my daughters so that they would have a comic that they could read and that my friends could read. It was a true all ages comic without it being pejorative and talking down to the reader type of thing. Just straight up adventure, the same way newspaper strips used to be, like Terry and the Pirates and stuff that adults read every single Sunday, Um, and so you flash forward to I don't know, was it 2020, something like that? I released a horror book called The Chenoo, and then after that, I did a sci-fi western called Alien Alamo, and then I'm currently crowdfunding on Indiegogo a book called The Ghosts of Matacumba Key, and if you can see, you can see the thread. It's all horror, sci-fi based stories, and they all interconnect. And they even interconnect with previous stuff that I'd done, like Monster Island and Joe Frankenstein, which I did for IDW. So the Ghost of Matacumba Key, which is the current book that I'm working on, will connect all this stuff and will reveal how the universe is tied together. So it's really exciting and fun. Problem is that if anybody listening here tries to look it up, they won't find it because Indiegogo has put a shadow ban on the campaign. There's a no index code. So you
Really?
can't look it up. You have to have the direct link
No.
to get to it.
Well, definitely share that with us, and we'll include it, in our show notes and everything for it.
Okay, perfect.
Definitely, send that out.
I will.
I find it interesting. You started off this
Well,
interview.
let me just back up. If
Yeah,
you
yeah.
go to my website, compasscomics.com, there's a link to it there.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Great.
and my other books are also available there too.
So when we started, you mentioned kind of doing like monster, or reading monster
Yes, I was a
related
monster
stuff,
kid. Yeah.
and here we are talking again. Did you ever want to kind of venture into more of the horror monster related stuff, and throughout your career, maybe getting into like like more like Tales of the from the Crypt type of work, or Vault of Horror, things of that nature?
Well, not in the terms of those type of anthology books, but certainly the subject matter
Yeah.
was something I've always interested in. I'm not the kind of horror guy like say Bernie Wrightson.
Okay.
The kind of stuff I like is adventure horror. I like heroes to root for in a horror setting. So horror is the envelope that surrounds the action with the characters. And there's always some type of hero or heroic person to root for.
Interesting.
That's the kind of stuff I like. And when I look back at like there's a movie that Universal released called The Mummy's Hand in 1940. And it's really the precursor of Indiana Jones because it's about this two-fisted archaeologist and he's going off to find this princess Ananka, and then so they unleash the mummy and all that kind of stuff. But there's horror, there's comedy, there's adventure, there's action. And I was like, that's the kind of movie I like, and that's the kind of horror movie I wanted to do. Now the Chenoo, was a straight up horror, like rated R horror film. But again, I had people that you could root for. A lot of people, got the axe in that story, but the main ones, that we kind of set up as our protagonist, survive. And I like that in horror, that you can watch it and enjoy it and safely watch it, knowing that the guy you're rooting for is not necessarily going to get killed, but you wonder how they're going to get out of it. That's the fun of it. And then everybody else is expendable,
It's more like the classic universal horror type.
Well, Hitchcock turned that on its ear with Psycho, because he established in the beginning that Marion Crane, the Janet Leigh character, was the hero, but in fact, she's not the hero. She's the big star. Yeah, she was the big name that was on the thing, and she gets knocked off, like 45 minutes into the movie, and you're like, what the hell? The real star is her sister, who
Right.
or the real hero is the sister, who would never give up on her and stuff, and then she's the one who exposes everything. So it's that same type of thing. You're rooting for her, and at the same time, people that you come to like, are expendable in the story. It makes it interesting. I think it's a really great dynamic.
Yeah, I like the idea of, no rules. Just because they're the big name person doesn't mean they're going to live through it.
Right.
And the
You
fact
want surprises.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you can off that person, I think, is fabulous. It certainly makes it more interesting.
Yeah.
You can kind of, like with any movie or TV show, you could see, like, certainly in the Murder, She Wrote, whoever that particular guest is, or whoever that person is, like, oh, you can tell, well, that's the bad guy. That's the one who did it. That because, he was on Fantasy Island doing the same thing. So anyway, Graham, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been extremely interesting.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
I could probably talk more about horror because I love that, but
no, I got time if you want to continue on. It's up to you guys.
Where did you get the idea for your the concept? Because that's not an easy name to pronounce that you mentioned.
Which one?
The last one that you're
the Ghosts of Matacumba Key?
That.
Yes. Well, I grew up in Florida, and in the Florida Keys, there's the upper and middle and lower Matacumba Keys.
Oh, that's a thing. Okay.
It's part of the Florida Keys archipelago.
Okay.
And in 1935, did you ever see the movie Key Largo?
Yes.
Bogart? Okay.
Yep.
Well, Old Man Temple talks about the hurricane of 1935 in that movie. It's the most powerful hurricane that ever hit the United States. Sustained winds of over 200 miles an hour. 500 people were killed. They were finding their bodies in the swamps and stuff, long afterwards. Cars were showing up 20 years later, buried in the sand. And that's the starting point for my story. Is that hurricane plays an important part in it, but it takes place today. It takes place now, and there's this couple that's a private investigation firm, Misty Fahrenheit. How's that for a name? Because she's hot.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, Misty Fahrenheit and Mike Meathead Ratowski, who was a former MMA fighter.
I was going to say, he's a wrestler, right?
Right? Yeah.
I think I saw him last Monday.
To his enemies. Anyway, they get involved, and they're dealing with a crime lord out of Miami, and that guy's doings start to unearth the ghosts. And so there's a mystery about what happened in 1935 that Misty and Mike have to solve, and also it'll help solve the crimes that are happening today.
That's interesting. Do you have now, assuming the Indiegogo, everything moves or runs according to plan? I don't know how they actually go, but do you have a proposed time or idea when that would be released?
Yeah,
or is that all dependent upon when that kind
of when you set your set up your campaign, you have to give it an estimated release date.
Okay.
And my date's August.
Oh, well.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So
Cool.
I want to have it done and printed and shipped, begin shipping by August.
Okay.
Yep. I've
That's great.
done,
That's
I did 2 campaigns this past year. I shipped Alien Alamo and a 112-page hardcover called Giant Size Two-Fisted Manly Tales that shipped this year. That was a celebration of toxic masculinity. And I had some of the best writers and artists working on that book. Chuck Dixon, Mike Barron, Bo Smith, Kevin Grievous. I had artists like Butch Geis, Bart Sears, Larry Stroman,
Oh, wow.
Kelsey Shannon. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. They're all 10-page stories. There's 10-page stories of toxic masculinity.
And what's the name of that one again?
Giant Size Two-Fisted Manly Tales. And it's available at compasscomics.com.
And welcome back. So what did you guys think? I had a fun time talking to Graham. Really interesting guy, really cool. He's from the East Coast, which we always enjoy talking to those guys. I really like the idea of more and more creators creating their own stuff. Don't get me wrong, the mainstream comics are always fun, but the independent creator-owned content I find a little bit more compelling nowadays. And he's kind of carved out his own Graham Nolan verse of his own comics, and they all kind of live in the same universe. So, fun, interesting stuff. If you get a chance, go to compasscomics.com, and we'll put the link in our show notes, and have a check it out.
Yeah, kudos to you and Oren for another great interview. I enjoyed this one. It was great getting to know Mr. Nolan and his work that I'm not familiar with, and it was great getting to know about how the work that I am familiar with came about. So, again, hats off to you guys. Yeah, so we're in a little bit of a Mike's missing streak here. It'll be going on for a little while, so. You guys that don't like me, you're not going to be seeing much of me, but you guys that do like me, I'll come back in spectacular fashion in a couple weeks. But that's enough for this episode. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.